minutah. I was just telling in Slovene that we will start in a couple of minutes since we are waiting for more. This session will be in English. Previous one was a little bit hybrid, using both languages, but now we will be completely in using English. Also to point out that all the participants are super welcome to ask questions at any time, or I mean to put them in chat, and so we can address to them later, so they don't forget them.
Super, yes. Well, you just let me know when you want me to start, and
sure,
we'll do that.
Gašpar, misliš, da lahko začnemo počasi?
Ja, mislim, da lahko začnemo, ni problema.
Super. Hvala. Okay, so welcome back. As mentioned before, we have very interesting guest with us. Dr. Henriette wrote Cunliffe. I hope I pronounced it at least a little bit correctly. She's associate professor in the section for galleries, libraries, archives, and museums at the University of Copenhagen in Denmark. Today's lecture will be about, so Henriette, basically why we invited her, she authored two very interesting books that we found super interesting. One is on participatory heritage and one on the open heritage data. And today's lecture will focus more on the open heritage data, which is also super interesting topic relating to our already previous session. Maybe Henriette, I will give the floor to you to briefly introduce yourself and the topic of your today's lecture, and then let's dive into it.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Luca. So, yes, as mentioned, I will focus on my latest book, Open Heritage Data. It came out last year in the summer, of course, in the middle of COVID lockdown this summer, so it wasn't a big publishing event, but since then, and especially this week, I've had a good opportunity to talk about it in the last couple of days at the Sharing is Caring conference, which I mentioned earlier. And I just wanted to point towards that one also, if you're interested in more of the conversations that I'm hoping to start up today. There are some videos and various material from that conference also that might be of interest. So let me just change the slide. As I said, my name is Henriette Rode Cunliffe, and I am an associate professor in digital humanities in what we call the Glam section at the Institute of Communication at the University of Copenhagen. So I come from a background in archaeology. So I have also been an archaeologist, and I've been out digging and finding heritage material in the ground. I then did a MSc in Southampton in archaeological computing. So that's where I took a turn more towards working with heritage data and finding ways that we can collaborate and also combine heritage data sets and communicate them and share them with each other. Actually, my master's
Jaz bi prosil samo vse, da ugasnete mikrofone, ker nekatere vas lahko slišimo. Hvala.
So my master's thesis actually looked at how we can do what I at the time called interoperability between heritage data sets across Europe. And then a few years later, the Europeana came and kind of started doing this sort of interoperability of heritage data across the different European countries. And that's kind of very much become the current situation that we are in now, that where there is a lot and more data that is being shared. So then I went on to do a PhD in Oxford in ancient history / digital humanities. So I started to move more into the sort of information science field. But yes, so the book Open Heritage Data is sort of also a collection of my experiences from the very beginning of working with heritage material to the work I do today and teach also at the University of Copenhagen. So yes, the book is aimed at heritage professionals, but also at what I still like to call amateurs, even though some sometimes understand the word in a more negative light. But I understand it more as people who do work with heritage in this example, but who don't necessarily have an education, or who don't do it as a job. They don't get funding, and they have their own funding to do it, as well as heritage institutions who I find to a high degree are asking questions like, do people still need us, and how are we going to be relevant in this modern day and age? And I wanted to show them also that people do still care about heritage, and that they can use heritage data to some degree. So I wanted also to equip them with some skills and some knowledge about what this whole idea of data is, and how they can kind of move forward and work with heritage data. And the other book that I wrote a few years ago with, or I co-edited it with Andrea Copeland, that contains a lot of different articles, which are also again aimed at heritage professionals and the institutions in particular. And those different articles try to give an idea of what participation is and what it looks like in the heritage sector. So there are lots of different case studies in this book, which some of them look at the challenges that are involved, and others look at different solutions, or in ways in which participation can be a solution to some of the issues that we have in the heritage sector. So now I want to move over to this, my actual talk, which I have recorded beforehand, because I don't know if you can hear in the background, I'm at home with my daughters here now, it's afternoon. So I've recorded this for my own comfort, but I just want to say before I turn this on, that I have made some discussion points for the end. And if you have any questions along the way, I'm happy to talk about it at the end, and we can perhaps have a little discussion. Yes, so let me just stop this screen sharing and start another one. Okay, I will turn this on. Is this full screen now, Luca, or? Yeah, super, thank you. So for this part of my recorded talk, I would like to get into the details of the Open Heritage Data book that I've written. First, I want to talk about openness in heritage and the sort of genealogy of this openness, how it's developed from less open to more open today. Then I want to have a short discussion about sharing legally and the issues involved in this. I would then like to take you through a few examples of how open data is published and used in heritage. And then I would like to talk a little bit about data science and show you some examples of how we use tutorials and visualizations in data science, and how we can use open data for this. So first I want to say a little bit about this concept of openness in heritage. And this discussion begins with why I chose these three words for my title, so open heritage data. I did that because they can kind of be split into three other terms that I think are very relevant to understand in this concept. So open heritage is the first one, which I relate to the idea of open government, the fact that there is openness, transparency in our understanding of the world, in the things that we do, that there is openness. And heritage is often something that is a part of government structures also, even though I will later come into how it can also be done outside of government structures. But I think the idea of open heritage is also something that is related to the idea of open government. And it's also related to the idea of making things equally accessible. So a sort of democratic idea of having things accessible for everyone. The second term is heritage data, and this is the concept of where we see heritage as anything that is our legacy, anything that is saved for future generations. And in this sense, heritage data is all the information technically about this heritage that is saved. Often this can be as metadata, so data about data. This could be, for example, if we have a lot of artifacts in our collection, there might be data about these artifacts. For example, a bowl from the Iron Age. We might have information about the bowl. So the bowl itself is an artifact, but the information, the metadata that we have about the bowl is also interesting to register and share with others. For example, the height of the bowl, where it came from, the fact that it is identified as being from the Iron Age, and so forth. We also have text material. This could be text material written in the in history, so historical text material. We have images. This can both be images that, like for example, art that is made in a historical period, but it could also be images we have today of, for example, the artifacts. And then we have a lot of protocols, which is what I've kind of called these lists that we have of items, of things. These are closely related to governments also, because a lot of governments have a lot of lists of things, lists of people, like census records, birth, death, marriage of the people living in the country, any kind of registration. In Denmark, we have a very funny, I think other countries have it too, a very interesting registration of dogs and dog owners, going back to the 19th century. So that's very fun and interesting data set. Then we have the idea of open data, which is of course a more technical part of this. This is related to the ideas of open source, open access, open source being specifically like code that is openly available for other people to use and build on the code. Open access is something we often hear about at universities or in libraries. The fact that material publications are openly available, you don't have to pay to get access to them. In terms of open data, this is also where we have the discussions about the legal and the technical and the practical sort of access to the data. So in this genealogy of heritage openness, I usually start with the idea of amateurs. These, when we think about these in a sort of historical sense, we will often think about the amateurs of the sometimes 18th, but mostly 19th and early 20th century, who were people that were self-funded. who didn't necessarily have a heritage, or who didn't have a heritage education. If they did have that, they wouldn't be amateurs, of course, who didn't have a heritage education, but who often did have some sort of education, and who had funding of their own. And this early heritage work was often shared through family and other close ties. But when I say early heritage work, I also want to point out that today many heritages and many stories, many collections of heritage material is still being collected and kept by amateurs around the world. This is in particular when institutions and governments haven't yet seen the need to collect and communicate certain heritages. We will often find that there are amateur groups who are still making sure that things are being saved for future generations. So the case that I use here is a Danish father and son, where they were both pharmacists. So they had some sort of education and they had funds, but they didn't have a heritage education. So in that sense, they were amateurs. Not that there was anything wrong with the work that they did, but there was also some differences in the work that they did. So where the father, Christian Mikkelsen, was very much a collector. He simply collected items. The son, Paul Helve Mikkelsen, was much more an archaeologist, an amateur archaeologist who did excavations and who wrote reports about these excavations and made sure that he took pictures and was very thorough in his excavation technique. Then the next step that I see in this sort of genealogy, which is both a historical genealogy but also more a thematical genealogy, is that we have this growing institutionalization and also growing professionalization, which is opening up heritage and heritage work to a more professional class. Professional in the sense that they are getting paid for it and they have often an education in it. And when I use the words amateur and professional, I know that this sometimes triggers an idea that I'm talking about amateurs who are not good at something and professionals who are good at something. And there's a specific reason why this triggers that idea, because the professional sphere has had a need to kind of put a value on the education that they give, and thus they try to make it be more valuable than obviously not having the education. So there's a very natural reason why we today think of professionals as being also experts and better than people who are amateurs. But I think I still use them because I don't originally that is not necessarily, and I still see today that that is not necessarily the case. You have people who are amateurs in that they don't have funding, or they have their own funding, so they don't need to get paid, and they don't have education, but they are still they can still have a great expertise in the work that they do. So this is just to say that the institutionalization sort of comes after having a period, usually having a period of where amateurs are taking an interest in the material. Then we have an institutionalization where the institution, whether it's a gallery, library, archive, or museum, is taking an interest in this heritage. And they also this also gives a formalization of access to this heritage from the members of a community of, for example, amateurs and their family members and their friends, to suddenly to members of a profession, which is both an act of opening up to more people, so people who don't necessarily have the funds and who could come from different classes in society. But it's also a little bit a closing of access for the people who don't have the education or the credentials. The case that I've used to show this in the book is one of Nina Frances Layard, who was a 19th, 20th century English amateur archaeologist. And she was very active around Ipswich in the UK. And she did a lot of excavation and she did a lot of collecting, but because she wasn't a professional archaeologist, and also because she was a woman, there were limits to how she could access the discussions and the conversations on heritage at the time. The next step is physical access, which I really think is such a great step for openness in heritage. The fact that we give access for technically anyone. We say for anyone, although it is only an access for people who are paying and who are local in the sense that they have funds to be, either they live close by or they have funds to go to the place. And they can see, they have access to a selected and curated part of the collection. So while I do think we should celebrate this step of physical access, I do want to question whether physical access really meets most needs. There is often the idea in many heritage institutions that physical access is all that is necessary, that the only people who are interested in this history, this heritage, are people who are local, people who maybe are from the same country, people who are from the same town, people who have this physical access to the heritage in question. And I do want to challenge that idea because I don't think that that is necessarily true. I think the internet has shown us that there are people who, for some various reasons, and sometimes it can be the reasons can be many hundreds of years old. For some reason, they have a heritage interest in things that are not in their local area. For example, we see it in family history. People who know that their families come from a different part of the world, who might have an interest in this history of a different part of the world that they don't have physical access to. So for them, physical access is not access at all. The case I've used here is the Nougat Digital Archive in South Korea. This is also an example of a heritage, a piece of heritage that for years was kept and survived because of a family, some amateur historians, a family who had been involved, who survived, families of survivors from this incident, and they had kept the story going until the 90s. So this happened in the 50s during the war, and then in the 90s, it wasn't till then that there was so much focus on this massacre at Nougat that they then developed a museum and an institution around this piece of heritage, which is now sort of in charge of this heritage. At the same time, we also have Dong Sin, who has developed this Nougat Digital Archive to bring this history, this material about the Nougat massacre from the physical location in South Korea to the internet, where people, whether they are of Korean descent and live, for example, in the US or other places in the world, or whether they just have an interest in this, they can get access to the material on the internet. Which brings us to online access. And online access is, again, a step that we must celebrate greatly. It is amazing. But again, I want to sort of show you the limits of online access, because it's very much in the sense of a look but don't touch access. So the greatest potential of online access is that there are things that you simply can't or don't have the means of experiencing physically. Like we're talking about before with the Nougat, very few of us have the means to go to South Korea and experience this in ourselves and experience this museum, but we can access it online. And when I talk about online, I also mean digital and things that are then through a digital form available online. So it is great. And I wanted to show you just shortly this video, about where David Attenborough is experiencing this Hold the World virtual reality thing.
Hold the World is an interactive virtual reality experience.
Welcome to London's Natural History Museum. In these drawers today, there is a special selection of objects ready for you to explore.
Thank you very much. Now, there we are. Wow. Whoa. That is amazing. Heavens above. Gosh. Whoops. Look, it was going to hit me in the face. I'm bound to put my hands up to defend myself. It is breathtakingly beautiful.
Okay, so my point with this is that even David Attenborough, a very privileged man who has traveled the earth and seen so much in natural history and natural sciences, even he can't experience dinosaurs in real life. So there are some things that we simply we can't, or we don't have access to experience physically, and that this is where digital online access really provides different opportunities to experience this. For example, an Iron Age village. We need a different way of experiencing an Iron Age village if we can't experience this physically. So the case that I've chosen to use in the book is one of the online parish clocks in Lancashire in the UK. And they've simply transcribed a bunch of old parish records, so the church's records of births, deaths, and marriages. They've transcribed them and put them into a digital format so that anyone on the internet can have access to searching and finding their ancestors. But my first point was also that online is amazing, is great, no doubt about it, but it is still very much a look but don't touch access. It's still very much a question of, you can see it, you can see this video with David Attenborough, you can even see, or maybe you're so lucky you can experience the VR yourself, but you can't touch it, you can't do anything with it. So you can't do creative reuse with it. You can't make a new type of dinosaur in this system if you wanted to. You can't use it for research, use it for creative pursuits. You can just view it, browse it, search it, look at it. So this brings me to the last step in this genealogy of heritage openness. This is the step where we have access to the data itself, access to the columns and the tables, the data formats that or the images themselves. We have access, and we are allowed to use this and reuse this. This is what the open movement has to say about this, or the Open Knowledge International. Open means that anyone can freely access, use, modify, and share for any purpose, subject at most to requirements that preserve provenance and openness, which means that for it to be open, anyone has to be able to access it. They have to be able to use it, to modify, to change it, and to then share it on with other people. At the very most, we can ask that they say, like, they preserve provenance, so they say where they have it from, who originally made it, and that they also preserve openness, so that if they take something that is open, openly available, they make something new of it, that new thing that they make should also be openly available. So the idea here is that there are these open Glam principles that I have also worked with. So the open Glam principles, which you might know from the open Glam movement, are to release metadata on artifacts. The second is that no new digital copyright should be added to works that are in the public domain, which is especially a little dig at museums and other institutions who have material that is in the public domain already. There is no known copyright on this material. For example, in archaeology, we dig a lot of material out of the ground, and obviously there's no copyright on an Iron Age bowl because we have no, whoever made it, it was made far before copyright. So there's no copyright on the Iron Age bowl. Then the museum might take a picture of the bowl and then put their copyright on that picture and say, well, we took the picture, so this is the museum's copyright. It might also be, for a slightly newer example, a photograph of a piece of art, maybe a two-dimensional painting, where the painting itself, because the painter has been dead for a certain amount of years, so the painting itself is in the public domain, but the museum takes a picture of the painting and says that they have the copyright of this picture of this painting. So this is also what they are criticizing here. So the third is to be clear about whether it can reuse the data. The fourth is to use machine readable open file formats. And the fifth is to engage with the public about open content. So I've taken some of these, later I want to show you the model that I've made to kind of look at how open data is. And some of it's borrowed from these principles and some of it's borrowed from other ideas of open data. The case that I've used here is that of Ogos Photos, which is a series of portrait photographies that are taken in the 19th century in the Danish city of Kolding. And the archive here has digitized these photographs, made them available online, completely open, and they are working on different ways that people can then creatively reuse these images. And we can see here to the left a school child who is doing some drawings on top of some material with this. You can just see that there's a girl in a chair, and she's from the 19th century Kolding. She's one of the portraits. So the school children are working actively with these portraits and reusing them and reworking them and being creative, and also talking about history and learning about history at the same time. So this is my model that I wanted to show you. So the Open Heritage Data Model has 5 questions, and they're simply questions that can be asked of any material. So the first question that I ask here is whether the material is published online with metadata so that it can be searched and filtered. And this, the example of this I wanted to show you is from the Arab Image Foundation in Lebanon, where they have put information or photos. They've put photos online for anyone to search and look at. And the images all have this metadata. They have describing what we see on each image, where it's from, when it's from, and so forth. The second question is, whether the material is published with an open license or in the public domain, and is this clearly communicated in conjunction with the material? So we have a lot of material that is made available online to just search and look at, like the material in question 1. But we still need material that is available with open licenses or as public domain, so that it's clear that people can use it. For example, this image from the National Gallery of Denmark's website, where it's clear that the picture, the painting by Anna Petersen of the Breton girl looking after plants in a hothouse, which is one of my personal favorite paintings, actually it is free to use, because the painter, Anna Petersen, has been dead since 1910, so she's been dead for over 70 years. And thus I can take this painting, this image that they provide at the museum, and I can reuse it for any purpose that I wish. The third question asks, does the institution actively encourage reuse of the material and provide support for anyone who wishes to reuse it free of charge? And this is something I've chosen to exemplify with the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam in the Netherlands, where they have made all their material available openly, so anyone can use it, but they've also created this Rijksstudio, where it's very clear that they encourage you to reuse. They encourage you to make collections of the material. They encourage you to create your own, like, order prints of the collection, or create your own route in their app. So they encourage you actively on the website to download and make new things from their art. They even have a design competition that runs sometimes, where they get people to make new masterpieces, new funny, interesting things out of their artwork. The fourth question asks whether the material is available in an open, machine-readable format that anyone can export or download. And the example I've chosen here is the Portable Antiquities Scheme in the UK, which is a scheme that encourages and enables anyone in the public to who's found through walking the fields or metal detecting, has found archaeological finds, and encourages them to get these finds registered and photos taken of them. I don't think for most of these finds people get to keep them, but they just want to register where they were and their context, so that this material can be used for research by archaeologists. And a lot of archaeologists have used, and a lot of projects have used this data source to do various research projects. And all their material, all their data can be downloaded as different file formats. So that's a good example of this question. The last question, question 5, asks whether the material is available through a well-described API that anyone has access to. So whereas the previous question and the previous example of the Portable Antiquities Scheme had material available to download as a static copy of what is in the database, this last question focuses on the material being available through this thing that we call an API, so an application programming interface. And that means that we can send off a request to the database through a URL that's formatted a bit like we have here on screen for the Trove API. We send off a request. In this case, we're asking for anything that related to gardening in a newspaper, and we want it back as in the data format JSON. And this is what we get back. We can see here, we get a response for our query on gardening in newspapers, and we get a lot of newspaper articles back. And this material, this data can then be reused in different applications. We can reuse it. I've had students reuse it for to do visualizations, to make graphs over newspapers, and I'll show you a bit later in the data science portion some of the graphs I've made based on this material here. So Trove is actually, it's not very clear, but Trove is the National Library of Australia's portal to heritage material from the library itself, from other libraries and universities in Australia. And they make this available. And the thing about the API versus the previous download option is that with the download option, you're getting a copy. You're downloading a copy, it's on your computer, and then you can do stuff with the copy, but if they update the database, your copy is not going to reflect that, obviously. But with the API, if you use that in a live system, like if you use it in an app, then every time someone clicks a button that sends off a request to the database, they will get the newest data set back. So it's live in that sense. You're getting a live version of the database that you want to have access to. You're getting live response back every time you send off your URL request. So now I want to talk about the second part, about sharing legally. I only have one slide for this, and I don't want to spend too much time on it because I do find that it's a difficult subject. And one of the things I want to point out here is also that I found in my research that fear of legal consequences is something that takes up a lot of space when we talk about legal sharing. And it's really a problem because the fear of legal consequences is hurting creativity and it's hurting innovation. When people have fear, they are not going to be creative, they're not going to be innovative. We see it both inside the institutions and we see it outside of the institutions. So we see it both with the actual, the people working in institutions who are scared of putting heritage material that is in their care, putting it online, because they might have heard about a museum or an archive that has been, where it's had some legal consequences that they have shared material online. And so to get over this, I think we need some more knowledge, but we do also need some more support from politicians and from government agencies. So in terms of sharing legally in the book, I've focused on 3 types of laws. So the first is sort of the heritage laws, which tell us who's in charge with safekeeping the heritage, what policies govern the access to the different heritage materials and also the publication of these materials. So which legal entities and which policies do we have that govern what we should and can do with heritage material? And this can look very different. I just want to say, with all these 3 laws that I've focused on, in the book, I set it up as questions that use as, if you work with an institution or if you work outside an institution, that you can ask in your government context or in your country or in your region, to figure out what is the deal here, because it's very different across the world. Again, with copyright laws, sometimes it seems on the internet like there is one law, and usually we think of it as the American copyright law is the one that because a lot of online companies and platforms are based in the US. This is where we get idea of what copyright law says. But that's not actually the case. Across the world, there are different ways of interpreting copyright laws. There are different lengths of protection for copyright. So usually in many countries, I will say, we see that the rule is 70 years after the creator has died. For 70 years after the creator has died, their works are still protected by their copyright, which means, of course, they are not benefiting because they're dead, which means that the people who have inherited from them are benefiting from this copyright for 70 years. That is, for many countries, the length of copyright. But some countries have longer and some countries have shorter. Some countries have maybe down to 50 years. So there are differences across the world. Actually, Wikipedia is a great place because people on Wikipedia have necessarily made it their business to know about copyright, because that's a big part of putting things on Wikipedia. So they actually have some good pages where you can see what the copyright lengths in different countries. Another question to ask about copyright is whether the copyright is the same across different types of work or different types of media. Is it the same copyright for a database that we have for a painting, for example? And then the third thing to ask is about the free cultural license. There are different licenses. You might know of the Creative Commons license. How do they work in your jurisdiction? Also, how does public domain work? When is something in the public domain, and when is it an orphan work? The third law that I want to focus on today is, and which I focus on in my book, is that of data protection. This is again very different from across the world. So the first question is there actually a data protection law? There are various laws around the world for data protection. The one that has taken up a lot of space in our discussion the last couple of years has been the European GDPR, and the way that data protection works in the GDPR. That is not to say that we didn't have data protection laws in many countries before that. We did, but the rolling out of the GDPR has had a lot of consequences in terms of how we think with heritage material, actually. Even when heritage has usually not been a part of many of the discussions about the GDPR, it has had some consequences for heritage. For example, the question of do we data protect people who are dead? So the last question here is, what are the time limits for data protection after death? That is quite relevant to know when you're working with heritage material, because as any family historian will testify to, most of the people, if not all of them, are dead. So it's very relevant to know whether you can work with their data, or whether you have to protect their data as you would someone who's still alive. Another question to ask of data protection laws is whether there are provisions for archival and heritage material. When the GDPR was first rolled out, nobody seemed to have thought about what do we do with material that is archived, that we have as heritage material. But since there is provisions now for that in the law, so there is still a right to get your information removed, as long as it's not being kept for archival purposes. So in that sense, I think it's also very important to consider one of the ideas of the GDPR is this idea of the right to be forgotten. And I would very much argue that we also need to discuss the right to be remembered. We must never use data protection laws as a tool to forget parts of our, especially minority heritages in various countries, with the idea that we are protecting them. We can instead be forgetting them, and that's not protection. That is not in their best interest to be forgotten in heritage. So it's very important that we think very carefully about what we're doing with data protection laws, that we don't misuse them to end up forgetting people and groups and populations that are not visible in our culture. So this third part is some examples I want to show you. So here I want to use the example of the Rijksmuseum again in the Netherlands. And they actually made their collection available with high resolution images already around 2011 to 13. As we saw earlier, they are also encouraging people to use these images in various ways, but the goal of the museum was actually to get the public more familiar with their collection. They simply wanted to be where people are, where people search and where people find culture. So this is also why Rijksmuseum and other, especially art galleries, have good connections with Wikipedia and especially Wikimedia, the image part of Wikipedia. And they upload high resolution images of their collections to Wikipedia, so people can see them and use them in articles and download them from there also. The example I want to show here for libraries is a lot of libraries are putting old editions of books and scanning them and putting them online also. And the example here is the Smithsonian Libraries, which of course, for all the whole Smithsonian Institute is the different libraries. I think there's about 21 of them that are collected in this portal where you can search and see their material. And a lot of the material, some of the material is also available as open access. The example I want to use for archives comes from the Danish National Archives. It's this Danish demographic database. So it's simply a large collection of census records that have been transcribed by volunteers, family historians for 30 years now. So since 92, this has been going on. And it's of course free to search and see all this material. So you can search in different parts of the country. You can search for names and you can search in the different census, and then you can get the records up and you can see them. But again, this is a great example of something that is online but is not openly accessible. Well, it is openly accessible to the lowest level, so you can see it and you can search it, but it is not available as data. You can't export the material, you can't download it, you can't use the live material for anything. The museum example I want to show you is from the Auckland Museum in New Zealand, and they've made their collection available through this collections online portal. And this is a very varied collection. And here you can search the items and you can export some of the items also, but they also have an API so that you can make your own site, your own app, your own research visualization of the material if you want to through this API. They even have this system, a bit like the Rijksmuseum, where you can make your own collection that you can then save. And then the last example I want to show you is an example that encompasses the whole Glam sector. Here I want to show you the Europeana, which is, you might know, is a cross-institutional collection. They gather material, but unfortunately only at a very sort of high metadata level. They gather material and then they link to the places, the websites where this material is also available in the different institutions. But because they are gathering so much different types of materials, from books, textiles here, archaeological material, photos, videos, lots of different types of material, they've had to find some very high level metadata that can be standardized across all this very varied material, which means that the only data they actually have in Europeana is really the title, as we can see here, where it's from, and then there might be some structural metadata about when it was uploaded and so forth. So in reality, if you want to use this data, I've recently made a blog post about explaining the Europeana API, where you can get access to all this data and you can use it for various things. But in reality, it is not the most interesting data set because it is very limited what data they have, because it comes from so many different institutions. But it is a new way to mediate material across institutional and across country, national borders also, the barriers that come across countries. They've done a lot of work with translation from different languages, so that you can search for something perhaps in Danish and you can actually access, and that will give you something that might come from a different country and be added in a completely different language. So the last part of this talk is about data science. On this slide, I want to show you how we can visualize open data. So the data that we get when we send, for example, a URL off to this API, this database, wherever that is. In this instance, it is the UK National Archives. They also have an API. So we sent off a URL to them, and that returned a data set in using the data format JSON. So that sent us some JSON back. So we can see that to the left, this raw data, which is in itself not very interesting and is definitely not very legible. So in this case, I've asked the UK National Archives to send me everything they have, all the material they have and the metadata for the material, where they can find the phrase Victory Garden. And the data that they sent me back has these different data points, which are visualized here to the left. This shows us that between 1941 to 1962, they have material from that period relating to Victory Gardens. And this graph shows the sort of distribution of like the amounts of different materials, archival materials they have in each of these years. Another thing we can do when we get this raw data is actually combine two or more different data sets. So this is an example of the green dots come from this data set, which is called the Open Context data set, and they have an API also. And it is a data set created by archaeologists who put up their data, which is then has geographical locations on it. And the pink dots come from the Swedish Open Cultural Heritage. And in both these data sets, I've asked them to send me data about finds of animal bones from the Swedish Stone Age. So here are two different data sets, which and one of them is a Swedish data set, and one of them is an American data set, but they each have data about animal bones, finds of animal bones in Sweden. So I've simply sent off a request to each of these data sets, and then the data that I got back, I've combined in a live way also. So on this page that I've made, if I update it, we might have a different distribution if they have updated the points in their data set. So this last slide is an example of how we can use a data set, a historical digitized data set, to answer research questions. And in this case, I have created I've written a short research question. It's a very simple research question, really. So when did Australian newspapers mention Mahatma Gandhi, and is there a connection to notable events in his political work? And I've sent a request off to the Trove API to get all the mentions, all the articles that mention Mahatma Gandhi in their archive. And with this data, with this JSON data that I received back, I was able to plot this into a simple graph with years along one axis and the number of articles on the other axis. And we can see here that there is, in fact, there seems to be more articles in the times, in the years where there are some very notable events in his on the international field in his political work. That is not to say that we can always take this information for given. We have to remember also that the actual data set is also a historical construct. It starts already, of course, with the newspapers that were published at the time, but then there's also which newspapers were saved in the archives. It's also a question of which newspapers have we then gone on to digitize, because not everything that is in archives is digitized and made available. In the Trove, there's a very good example with the centenary remembrance of the First World War, which was a couple of years ago. And at that time, there seemed to be, like, if you did a search in the database, you might get a lot of what's called material that came back from that time period. That's not because there necessarily were a lot more newspapers printed in that time period, but the more question of that there are a lot more newspapers digitized from that time period because they had a specific project aimed at digitizing some of that material. So that's important to remember also. So that's the end of my talk about the book. So thank you for listening to that recording. Let me just share my screen again with my slides. Here they are. So I don't know, Luca, if you wanted to say something, or if there are, how you would like to do this. But I prepared a few slides about for a discussion about open data in the Slovenian context. And the first one is sort of a series of questions. I like in my book also to ask questions of you, because I think it's interesting to get, I would like to get you to start thinking about these kind of things. So the first is a question of who are actually going to be the users, or who are the users out there who are interested in whatever material it is that we want to digitize and make openly available, and what are the potential uses of this material. Of course, there are also some questions that relate to rights. The rights, is the material already public domain? Is it something that the institution has created, or can they identify who created it, who funded it, and what are the rights surrounding these materials? And those can often be really difficult questions to answer, but I think they're very important questions, that because users are not going to be able to answer this question. So I think one of the big no-nos that I find sometimes is institutions putting this responsibility of finding the rights onto the users. That is a sure way to limit use from the get-go, because users are not going to do this, so they just won't use it. They'll find something else. Wikimedia has a lot of material already that is available to use, so they just won't use your material. And then I think a very interesting sort of exercise to do is also to make this risk analysis, because there's a risk with everything. So of course, a very obvious risk that a lot of us might worry about is this risk of misuse, or perhaps just an alternative use to the one that we were thinking it should be. But there is also a risk of oblivion, a risk of a material or a history being forgotten because it's not easy enough to access. So I think it's important to think about what are the fears involved in this. My experience with heritage institutions and users of heritage material is that there are a lot of fears sometimes. And as I said in the talk, fear is not a great starting point for innovation and creativity and all the things that we dream about. So I think we need to face these fears head on and talk about them openly. And then lastly, asking ourselves, why do we even want to share this material? What is the point of it? In my own field of digital humanities, I know that a lot of material has been digitized for the sake of researchers. And if I want to be a little bit provocative, I'll sometimes say that, is it really a good use of our funds to digitize something that is used by 5 researchers around the world who could have used Google Docs instead and gotten a perfectly good result out of that? Is that the best use of our resources? So I think sometimes it's interesting to have an open talk about these things.
Yeah. Thank you, Henriette, for pointing out these questions, which I think are very important. Absolutely. But I would like to ask you at this point, what, in your opinion, are the benefits for institutions to go into this open data, to offer open data services? Of course, once is this responsibility, of course, to share this data, but do you maybe also can identify certain opportunities that are maybe not so transparent at the first glance that they can also benefit from, like what can come back completely unexpectedly beyond, this sharing?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, because it's I could tell you a lot of good stories about things that have come out of it. Yeah. But actually, I would rather just point to all the things that we miss out on when we don't give open access to things. Because as a very creative person also, I often find that I want to do things with different stories, that I want to make something, maybe some art over, I want to communicate on my blog or to other people, and I get stuck because it's not openly available. I can't figure out who has what copyright and what the institution feels about me sharing this with the world. And I think that is this is just me, of course, but I think there is a lot of potential out there amongst people who are creative and who want to share whatever heritage it is that they're interested in, whatever culture they're interested in. And they just get stuck because they can't share it. There are barriers in the way of doing this. And I think that is probably where we're losing most potential, that people who have good ideas it's not openly available to them. Because of course it's easy to say that we can make all these, I can tell you about all these great projects I know where people have done, but to be honest, there are few of them that are known to the heritage sector, to the Glam institutions, because when they try to make events and they try to get people to use it, often interaction and engagement is very low. So I would rather that they looked out and identified the user groups or the potential groups that are already there and saw and asked what they, and tried to figure out what they could use instead. So for example, if you're an archaeological museum, and then try to identify which perhaps Facebook groups there are where people are actually using that kind of knowledge. For example, reenactors who need ideas for a new, well, in Denmark, very popular Viking age dresses, but perhaps other types of clothing from a certain period. I know there are lots of people who are very interested in vintage clothing also. So if you have a big collection of images from the 19th and 18th century, maybe that's something that they would get a lot out of. So it's a difficult question, but I really think that a lot of, if you want to see where it can be useful, you have to go out and find out who also cares about this material that you have.
Sure, but in your opinion, what is the pace of institutions actually opening their data? What would you say, like looking at the last maybe 10 years or you know, from your experience, is it happening with a rapid speed? Is it going way too slow for your taste? Your insights on that?
Yes, well, actually, that's a great question because it leads me on to the next slide. If I can, yeah. So this is the survey of Glam open access policy and practice that Douglas McCarthy and Dr. Andrea Wallace have put together over the last few years, and they're still adding to it. And if you have any more things that you think should go to on it from Slovenia, that I'm sure they'll be very happy to hear about it. I've put a link into this Google Doc, but you can also search it on the internet. It has nearly 1,000 institutions across the world that are putting material out there as with open access policies, and that is both something to celebrate. It really is. It is. And for someone who 10 years ago was really hoping that this was going to be the future, I am very happy that there are so many institutions out there who are doing this now. But on the other hand, I'm also a bit disappointed because there is a lot more institutions whose potential isn't a part of this, who could potentially be a part of this. And all these institutions, and maybe you can also tell me if that's the case for the Slovenian examples here, they usually represent the big national institutions in different countries. There's still a lot of small museums and archives and libraries also in various countries that are not a part of this, really. So I'm both happy, and I think that we can celebrate that we have come a long way, but I also think that it's not, it's definitely not there yet. There's still a lot of potential.
How much do you think technological kind of aspects play a role in this opening of the data? For example, do you think a lot of institutions actually have all this and it's just a matter of like removing the password kind of protection and opening it up? Or do you think there are a lot also institutions who are actually struggling with finding tools, or are there any kind of open source tools that they could actually use to offer this data in such an open way?
I think it's a bit of a mix, but because I actually think there are already available tools that can be used. I work a lot with a small archive in the city of Kolding that I mentioned in my talk, and they have made. They started by having just an open policy in the whole institution. They have an open policy that they want to put as much out there openly as possible. And they also started talking about, well, then we need to build a platform, and it's really difficult. And because I was consulting them, I said, stop, just make a Google spreadsheet and then stick it out there and then put it on Flickr. Because Flickr is a wonderful tool actually for sharing if you have lots of images, because it already comes with an API. So anyone can use that option, or put it on Wikimedia. That's also a great option. And the best thing about Wikimedia is then it can be used in Wikipedia articles, and then people actually see it when they search for it on the internet. So I actually think a lot of museums, and especially the big museums, they think that they have to make their own platform. I'm not sure that's the best idea at all, really, because then often it will be a small IT department or an external company doing it, and it still won't be integrated into the institution, because not even the institutions, people working there will use it. So no one will really be using it because it's too complicated. Building this platform from scratch is too complicated. But if instead they just put it all on Wikimedia, it's not too complicated. Nearly everyone can figure out how to. I mean, there are some things that can be a little bit complicated, but you can figure out how to upload it to Wikipedia, how to use it from Wikipedia. So I think that we should go more towards using those kind of existing tools. And I don't know how it is in Slovenia, but I know from a Danish context that the local Wikipedia group are very interested in working with archives and libraries and museums on opening up information and putting it where people search, because that's at least the experience from Denmark, is that people search for things first on Wikipedia. So if it's not there, as one of the great American historians said, if it's not on Wikipedia, it doesn't exist in our culture. Unfortunately, this might be shocking for some people to hear, but it doesn't exist in the place that we search for knowledge first and foremost.
We have a comment by Anja Ferković-Tršan, which says all Slovenian libraries contribute material to the Digital Library of Slovenia, and some museums also. Digital Library is our aggregator. Okay. The same goes for this central library of town Celje. She's very certain that it features, that is featured also on this list because they manage Camera portal. So at this point, I would also really like to invite all the participants to engage in the discussion. Maybe if somebody has some questions, you're super welcome to put them either on chat or really kind of just raise your voice by unmuting your microphone.
So is that the first one on the list here? Is that the Digital Library of Slovenia? Yes. I think that was the one that I also, this one, yeah, I put that in also the slides. So there was some things I could search for in English, which I tried. And I also wanted to show that one of the really nice things that they have here is first they also put the rights very clearly here, like in the example I had, where you can see that this material is public domain, but also give the option, as you can see over to the right, of searching for material that is in copyright or where the copyright is not evaluated or is in the public domain. Unfortunately, for this thing that I searched for, there was only one out of about 1,000 pieces of material that was in the public domain, which is the one I found here. But yeah.
Nice. Some more question, maybe?
Yeah.
I don't think we have it. Okay, I mean, in this case, I would really like to thank you for this very insightful lecture. I must say I have enjoyed it very much. And really, if you don't have any more questions, I would really like to thank you, Harriet, for taking time, for preparing this lecture and for joining us today. For sure, we will do our best to add as many as possible new Slovenian sources to the list in the future list to future years to come. Thank you. And I'll be now switching to Slovene, or I can also say it in English, that everyone is also, again, super welcome to join us tomorrow at 11 for yet another session, which will be more focused on how creatives and creative startups can actually develop interesting new and innovative solutions in collaboration with cultural institutions and museums. We will have two very interesting examples. Harriet, you might know them or maybe not. One of them is Daily Art from Poland, Zuzana. And also Sergio will be, and Susanna also works as a consultant to the museums on implementing new technologies and reaching new audience. And Sergio from Artviv, he's from Vienna, and he's developing augmented and VR solutions that are used by artists and also museums, quite renowned museums all around the world, and also galleries. I met both of them 2 years ago already in Zagreb, and I think they're really nice cases of this kind of collaborations. Tomorrow we will also have one Slovenian company that is doing 3D visualizations and has recently done some interesting projects in digitalizing cultural heritage, and also very interesting open call for a presentation of open call for joining Cultural Heritage Incubator, where such ideas and projects can find support for mentoring in developing them into interesting new services. So thank you all. Thank you again, Harriet, for your time, and lepo popoldne še naprej. Nice afternoon to you all.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
You too. Yes. Bye-bye.